welcome Bryan Post tonight for my last interview for Generation Change Summit. It's about the mental health of kids and teens. And I'm so happy to have you here. You inspire me deeply. I know you maybe 2 years now and follow your Post Institute pages, and I read your great book, From Fear to Love. But I couldn't even imagine that you're doing this work already for, I don't know, 30 years.
Well, about 25 years actual work with adoptive families and trauma, and then close to 30 years as a social worker.
Can you tell us a little bit, Bryan, how it started? How did you find out that we need trauma-informed care and now we need even more, you said? How did your way start? Because it's so important for us. We are way behind you here in Switzerland, but people start to feel there's something wrong. We have to change the perspective.
You know, for me, Daniela, it started back in probably about 1995. I had just finished my master's degree and was starting to work, do in-home work with families. And I was just doing the best I could. It really was all relationship based. Yeah. I've always been heavily kind of leaned towards relationship. And I started an agency shortly after I got out of graduate school, and I went to an Attach conference. And Attach is a association. It's an international association, actually. The Attachment for the Treatment and Training and the Attachment of Children. And I picked up a couple of books from a couple of authors and some audio books, and I was listening to them on the way back and on my way home after the conference. And I thought, I'm gonna try what they're writing about. And so I immediately started putting it into work. And I learned really quick what I didn't like, what didn't feel good to me, just intuitively. And then hang on. And then so I had two authors. One, I'll go ahead and tell you, his name was Foster Cline, and he's the founder of like Love and Logic. And so he was the first one that I read his book, and I did a session, kind of like he laid it out in his book. And I was like, this doesn't feel good to me. It doesn't feel intuitive. So move that one off. And then the other one was Martha Welch. And Martha Welch pioneered, these were two MDs. So they were not only kind of considered the forefathers of Attach, but they were both psychiatrists. So everyone kind of held them in higher esteem. And so Martha had pioneered an approach called holding therapy. And so the difference between hers and Foster's is that Foster did therapist holding of clients, and Martha encouraged parents holding of their kids. And so I started I had a family, a mom came in, she was desperate. So we went in, we did a holding session that evening, her husband and the little boy. And it was really powerful and really intense. I think up until that point, the only thing I'd done was talk therapy and some play therapy and stuff like that.
First thing was touch you did. The first thing.
Yeah, I didn't do any kind of touch stuff. And so I did the session Martha's way, where I had the parents holding each other and holding the kid. And it was really intense. And the next morning I called her center in New York, and she answered, excuse me.
No.
And I said, I want to learn more. And she said, okay, well, I'm going to be in Kansas City, a city here in the US. And she said, come and do my training with me. And so I drove up there a couple weeks later, and that started a 3-year mentor-student relationship. She and I had a really good relationship for 3 years. And I traveled around and did this work with her. And I was all in, because she was incorporating these principles I'd never heard of, trauma being a big part of that, attachment being a real important part of that. Yeah. And so I was going and doing the trainings with her and traveling around. And then I'd come back to my practice in Oklahoma at the time. And I would still be working with these families, and I was doing these intensives with families. And this one family, the original family, the mom was still struggling with this little boy. And I was like, I mean, I had taken them, we did intensives with Martha. I did intensives with this family. I mean, I had just poured a lot of energy into this family, and the mom and the son are still struggling. And I remember one day being with the family, and I was working with them, and I thought, I must be doing something wrong. And so I called Martha while I was right there with the family, and I said, something's not working, we're still struggling. What am I doing wrong? And she said, just keep holding. And as soon as she said that, I thought, that's not the right answer. Something's missing. And it's not going to be found by just doing more holding. And so this is a story that not a lot of people know. It just so happened that I had thought I had been given permission by Martha to write this parenting book. So I wrote this, I spent a year writing this parenting book. I can't even remember what it was originally titled, but I wrote it based on her parenting, based on my experience of working with families. And then once I finished it, I sent it to her. I sent it to a couple of her people, and they got all upset because I wasn't putting her name on it. And even though I gave her all the credit, because she was my mentor, I gave her all the credit. They were like, no, you can't publish this, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, well, Martha said I could write this book. And she never came to my defense. And so being an adopted child myself, felt rejected. I put the manuscript up on the shelf. We had a falling out at that point in time. And I just went off on my own. And so when I went off on my own, it was the best thing I could have done, because all of a sudden I started reading Alan Shore and Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel. And this is right in the middle of the decade of the brain. And then I'm still working with families, but I'm trying to figure out what it is that's missing. And it was just a culmination of things. I was working with a family in Washington State with a 13-year-old boy adopted from a Russian juvenile detention center. I was working with the dad and the son, and I was right in the middle of this. I was still doing this pseudo holding thing. And I was working with the dad and the son. And as I'm working with them, and it's really intense, I just happened to stop, and I noticed my body. And my feet, my toes were curled up, and my knees were kind of pulled up. And I thought to myself, I'm scared.
Yeah.
I was in a fearful position. And so as soon as I said that, I relaxed my body, and I said to the dad, stop. We're not gonna do this anymore. And I never did another forced parent-child holding session after that, because I realized where I had probably over 3-4 years kind of been adamantly opposed to Foster Cline and Love and Logic, because I felt like it was fear-based. I was like, all you're doing is shaming kids and threatening them, and you're using fear. I hadn't realized that having parents force hold their children, and the parents be really angry with their children to try to elicit their children's emotions, to go through this process to where they both relax, was just another fear-based continuum. And I was like, oh my gosh, what I had been missing with the other family is that he was stressed out. And she was stressed out. And in her desperation, she was just getting more stressed. She wasn't getting more relaxed. And therefore, she wasn't understanding him at a deeper level. And I know now, they had an in utero dynamic at work, because he had a real traumatic birth. And that just light bulbs after that went off. I went to Canada, and I had always asked a question. Ever since I had started working in that field of attachment, attachment is this great concept. It's a great concept. I love John Bowlby. Yes. Great respect for him. And I say that Alan Shore is the John Bowlby of our time. But attachment is a great concept, but what is it that leads to attachment? Because everyone's focused on attachment. Everyone's focused on creating this attachment between the parent and the child and getting this child to attach and all this jazz. And I'm like, that's a great concept, but what leads to attachment? And literally after about 2 years of asking this question in my head, one night I was in British Columbia, Canada. I woke up in the middle of the night and the question popped in my head. And I went back to sleep and I woke up the next morning. I was running a residential treatment center there. And I was driving to work and it was Vancouver. So it's rainy and still kind of dark and it's 7 o'clock in the morning. And I'm driving along and all of a sudden the word stress, like it hit me right in the top of the head. And I thought, stress, if you are stressed, you cannot develop attachment. What leads to the ability to be attached is the ability to be regulated. And I tell you, a light bulb went off in my brain, and I started diving into Alan Shore, who then just revealed everything. And one of my favorite quotes, it comes from Alan Shore's his text, his volume 1 of Affect Regulation and the Origin of the Self. In the introduction, and I've been lecturing for 20 years, so every lecture I recite this quote and I tell people this is it. And it wasn't even by Alan Shore, it was by Taylor et al. 1997, that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders.
Wow.
Affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. Being stressed out is the fundamental cause of all psychological, physical, behavioral, emotional distress and disorders. Yes. And I'm like, if that is true, then what do? Just reduce the stress.
Yes, that's what I think so long now. But I mean, that's so good. What happened? Did you bring it then into the world?
Oh, from that point forward, everything for me changed, because I started looking at myself differently. I started looking at my families differently. And then from there, I knew about fear, but I didn't know about love until I did know about love, but I didn't really know about love. I was listening to Deepak Chopra, and Deepak Chopra said there are only 2 primary emotions, love and fear.
Unbelievable. Oh my God.
And so then the rest has just been literally 20 years of just refining that moment, that concept, that idea from that moment, and seeing it at work in all the families I work with, and just trying to help people understand it and create as simple of an understanding as I possibly can, so people can grasp it. Because I truly believe, Daniela, that piece of information and education and knowledge, that little seed, if someone can take it and they can internalize it and they can grow it within themselves, and they can understand their own heart and their own mind, their own stress, their own fear, their own capacity for love, all the blueprints that work against them, and all the blueprints that go into the things they've experienced throughout their generational experience. If they can get that, then there is no problem or challenge that a parent can't navigate through. And so that's what I've done.
Wow. And when you were speaking, I could have started crying, because I feel it's so true what you say. It's just so true.
Yeah, it is. It is the truth. Yeah. In 1997, when I wrote it was actually 99 when I wrote my doctoral dissertation. The crux of it was the stress model. And I developed the stress model, kind of discovered it as I was lecturing, because I remember, because the stress model says all behaviors arise from a state of stress. So all behavior arises from a state of stress. And that just goes back to Taylor et al. The affect dysregulation is the fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. So all behavior arises from a state of stress. In between the behavior and the stress is the presence of a primary emotion. There's only two, love and fear. It's through the expression, the processing, and the understanding of the fear. And that starts with myself. I have to understand my own fear in the moment. I have to calm that fear down. Then I understand the fear in the other person. And when I can acknowledge that and help them express, process, and understand it, I can calm their stress and diminish their behavior. I started when I would do a lecture and people would come up and they would talk to me and ask me questions. And what I realized is that the questions were all the same.
Yeah.
It just, the words changed, the behaviors changed. But in my head, I would see them describing these, telling me about their kids' terrible behaviors. And all I'm focusing on is the presence of the stress and the fear. And so as they're telling me about the problem, I'm listening, but all I'm thinking about is how to reduce the stress underneath the behavior you're talking about. And then as soon as they finish, I'd say, well, try doing this. And they'd be like, oh my gosh, okay. And people would write and people would email and they'd be like, I did it once and it worked. And I'm like, oh my God. And I'm like, yeah, of course, because underneath the behavior is just stress. If you reduce the stress, the behavior is going to go away. And it really doesn't even have anything to do with trauma. Trauma is important. Trauma just makes us more sensitive. That's it. Trauma just makes us more sensitive. Trauma just gives us more hurdles that we have to jump over as we're running the race of life. But everyone's experienced trauma. And so the way to heal trauma, to at least create the foundation for another person to heal trauma, is through relationship. And what that means is you have to be able to keep yourself regulated enough in the face of stress so that you can give that traumatized individual essentially a blank relationship slate so they can have their experience in the realm of safety. So they can be stressed out because they rightly deserve to be stressed. So they can be stressed out and they can do it in relationship and in the presence of an individual who's not going to reinforce the negative stress, but is going to create a present state to help them. Bruce Perry says the brain always returns to the way the experience was handled the last time. So when you are able to stay present in the midst of another person's stress, in the midst of their traumatic reaction, in the midst of their threat, in the midst of their behavior, when you can stay regulated, what you're doing is you're reinforcing in their brain a positive experience in the midst of a negative state. And then what happens, because the brain changes from repetition and emotional impact, if you do that enough, every time they get stressed again, their brain goes not back to the trauma, but first it goes to the way it was handled the last time. And then if you can maintain that for that person, it doesn't mean that they're going to just all of a sudden stop having their challenges, because trauma is rough. I mean, it impacts us for the rest of our lives. But if you can create enough repetitive presence, their brain will start to heal. And eventually they won't go back to that trauma because their brain will have resolved it.
So amazing and touching and so clear. I started realizing that years ago when I lived in Zimbabwe, because people there are not stressed like us. And I felt I started healing there. I gave birth to my kid. And I started healing because it was totally different, but I understood it only a few years later. And when you say it now, I think, wow, it's so clear, like it has never been before for me. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have so many mothers in therapy and families, and they understand it, they start to understand it, but they don't get to the point to really learn to regulate themselves already. Do you have also still the feeling it's a hard process, or what is your
you know what it is? It is almost an impossible process. So if I'm just being honest, it is almost an impossible process, Because, however, I will say it is the most worthwhile process to endeavor towards of anything that exists.
Wow.
Because it is our higher spiritual selves. The challenge is that we are conditioned from generations, our cells, our DNA, our synapses, everything about us, every experience we've had is conditioned for fear and control.
Yeah.
That's the problem. And we go, the moment you go out in the world, your brain is reinforced with stress and fear conditioning. During this whole pandemic thing, all your brain is getting is stress and fear conditioning. And then it doesn't matter if it's related to COVID and not related to your early childhood trauma. Your brain doesn't distinguish between early childhood trauma and COVID and the insanity of governments and the craziness of schools and the hyper prescription of medications and the obsessive diagnosing. Your brain doesn't distinguish between any of that. All your brain does is picks up on the vibration and the energy, and then it says, oh, that's a like energy. Oh, we need to, now there's more negative and more negative and more negative and more negative. So what we're constantly fighting against is all of the negative energy and vibration and trying to change it to positive. That's why it's so hard. That's why it's almost impossible, but it's the best thing to ever work towards. And no parent has to be perfect. No, because none of us are perfect. You just have to make the effort. And sometimes it's just one time when your kid is rolling their eyes or they're whining or they're falling out on the floor, instead of you getting mad or doing just what your mom and dad would have done, just stop and take a deep breath. And remember, nobody's going to die. And then look at your child and see a scared little baby and just respond to the scared little baby one time, not 10, not every time, one time, and watch what happens. And then build on that if it feels good to you.
Beautiful. So beautiful, Bryan. I thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
I will show this everybody I know. I feel this. I mean, it's important for the politics. It's important for the schools. It's important for everything. It
is important for our world.
Yes.
And, at the end of the day, we just have to keep doing the best that we can. We're in a society that does not like to have the experience of not being in control. We are a fear-based people, and fear-based people need to be in control, and we don't even realize it. How we've been misled is in believing that we are trying to do what's in the best interest of our children. And that's BS. It's BS. It's not, it has nothing to do with our children at all. We are trying to protect ourselves, right? And so I say that we've not grown up in a spirit of love. We've not grown up in an environment of love. We've grown up in environments and with spirits of fear disguised as love. So what we think is love and what we've experienced as love is not love at all. It's fear. And so we grow up and we have these paradigms of thinking that we're loving people, and we're not. We're scared little freaking kids.
Yes.
We're just freaking scared kids. And then we get kids and they're supposed to be scared. They're supposed to be stressed, and they're looking for us to guide them and regulate them and support them and help and give them a foundation so they can unfold and thrive. So that's the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is between love and fear, and the vibration of that experience. And it starts with us. And it's so hard.
May I ask you how you discovered that? How you could hold this vibration of love? How do you elevate it again when you lose it? When you
You know, I always tell people, Daniela, it's simple, but it is not easy.
I understand. Yeah.
You know, it's simple because it just takes breath.
Yeah.
Just condition yourself to breathe. Just condition yourself to breathe. I was just talking to one of my managers. Her name's Tiffany. And in Crescent, when I'm in California, in Crescent City, I have the most wonderful little landlord. He's this 82-year-old Asian man, Chinese man. His name's Daniel. And I love Daniel. I call him Daniel-san. Daniel-san, he's always got the smile on his face. And I was just talking to Tiffany and she said, oh yeah, I talked to Daniel and he was just telling me how much he admires you. And he said, he's never seen you upset. Bryan never upset. These kids, and I'm not even raising these kids. They make me upset. I never see Bryan upset. I never see Bryan upset. And I have for many years made it a personal practice, which is, I believe, I call mindfulness practice, to just pay attention to my breath. That's where it starts. It starts at your breath. And when you forget about your breath and you hold it and you get stressed, that's okay. You don't have to judge yourself. You don't have to get more stressed out over it. Just take a deep breath and then take another one and take another one. And I tell people all the time, take a deep breath and tell yourself, I'm not going to die. I'm not going to die, because that's where you go in your brainstem. You go to the worst thing that ever happened that threatens to happen again. So you breathe and you practice your breathing when you're calm, not when you're stressed. Because when you're stressed, thinking becomes confused and distorted, your short-term memory is suppressed. And so then you forget. Practice your breathing when you're calm. And then when you get stressed, you'll breathe, which then turns on your oxytocin and reduces your cortisol, and it helps you be more present. Because stress does three things. Stress causes us to react from the past, it causes us to obsess about the future, and it takes us out of the present. And if you're not in the present, nothing exists, nothing matters. And Deepak Chopra said once, and I love this, he said, you cannot prevent the future from happening, but you can influence the future from the present. And I'm like, yes. Yes, when we get stressed, we start obsessing. We start obsessing about where our kids are going to be in 5 years and 10 years, in a day or a week, or when they're adults. We start obsessing about that. And then what happens is that obsession turns on our survival and our fear. And then we start doing fear-based things. We start influencing the future from the present. Stop sowing the seeds of fear in the present, because that's what shows up in the future. Sow seeds of love, sow seeds of faith and hope and belief and understanding. And that's what will show up in the future. It is not rocket science. It's quantum physics. It's brain science. It's cellular biology.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome, my friend. You keep up the great work.
I will. And you encouraged me today very much. I mean, I'm trying to practice since years, and I'm happy with my family and with my clients, but I want to go back to psychiatry now to really just go with this. Don't teach, don't tell, just go with this and look what happens. And this is encouraging me tremendously, what you said today.
You go for it.
So much.
Namaste.
All the best for you, and thank you. I'm really grateful.
Okay, Daniel. You keep up the great work.
Yes.
We'll talk again. All right.